There we go. All right. So what I want to talk about today with you is I want to make the move from chapter 3 to the first cycle of discourses from 4 on, and I probably won't go beyond the second or so response of Job. We'll come back to those in another class, but I want to make sure that we get into the nature of language. So before, I want to follow the same procedure as last time. I want to begin with your discussion and then my reflections on certain more formal features of the relationship between experience and language, as you see it in more general terms in chapter 3 and then in the responses of the friends. In other words, I want to try to tease out at the first moment, are you able to reflect on how the suffering person or the ersatz consoler responds in language? Can language do the job for pain? And can language do the job for consolation? Can language stay close to the ground and do a certain kind of redemptive work? And I mean that in the broadest sense. It brings a person to a second breath. By redemption in this case, I mean you can take a second breath. If suffering is that you catch your breath and you're holding your breath, redemption in this sense is you can let your breath out and then breathe another breath of air that's either given to you by the speech of somebody else or the kiss of somebody else. They breathe their breath into you, either through words or a kiss or a hug, and you're able to go on. Now, I'm not talking about salvation, and I'm not talking about anything ultimate. I'm talking about just, can I take another step, and will my friend's words fill me with a life force? On the assumption, which is my own personal theological assumption, that the life force that's breathed into you by a friend comes from God in the most ultimate sense. So it would be a way that God's help would come into your being. Right? It doesn't have to be in language. It doesn't have to be in a formulation, but something of the vitality of existence breathes through you. And if you block it, something of the divine doesn't enter another person. If you pervert it in speech, or you muzzle it, or you lie, or whatever, something that's potentially healing in breath that comes through language doesn't make it to me. And if it makes it to me, so that's part of my theological assumption, but if it makes it to me, it will allow me to take another breath, to do something so that I can live. That's a step towards redemption. It's a step towards building a life. So, as we move towards this fundamental transition, help me think for a second again about what is the relationship between language and pain in chapter 3. Just tell me some thoughts that you have, because I want to set up, hopefully not artificially, but some kind of a phenomenology between that chapter and the succeeding ones. Right? We're trying to find a way into Job that's a little bit unconventional, but close to the truth, perhaps, of Job in a deep sense. So, just things that we've been talking about or things that you've been reflecting on. Yeah?
It's expresses his pain in such formal language that you can see that it's a little bit distant for him still.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to see if other people feel that too. Look at the verbs and the nouns. Expresses pain, right? Mm-hmm. So there's an expressibility. You already did informal language. So you're picking up on the sense that it's not a primal scream. It's already an articulation. And your assumption is that he's now already distant or not yet. What would you say about...
More of the not yet. Not yet.
So you think he's not yet in touch with his experience? That something would happen that would break down that language or change that language?
I guess, he already has the very physical experience of suffering in 2, but he still can't mentally contend with it, and he still has the ability to reach towards, I guess, this very poetic language and the uneasy formality.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this. This is very interesting. So let me gloss that by simply saying, because I don't want to. There's no right or wrong here. Mm-hmm. At least I think the underlying structure of what you're saying is that he's still a person of culture.
Yes.
Okay? In other words, whatever, formal may be a strong term, but he is talking in the language of culture. Either he's risen to the level of culture because he has somehow been able to put pain into words, which would be a first step of culture before it's rational, perhaps. Or, if your point is the stronger point, then he will still have to come to his pain through that language of his first response. He needs something to say, and he uses the resources of culture in the first instance. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of what you're saying. Am I understanding you?
Yes, specifically that it's like you said, it's not a primal scream, and that, last class we talked about how it's like a line-by-line repeal of Genesis. And
so there's a kind of a... So now you're saying 2 things. So now you're saying that on the one hand, it's a primary cultural move, but it's like a wave that subverts it at the same time.
Yeah, he's in pain, but still cultured enough to work with the structure of creation. Okay. Some other thoughts? Again? Well, anyway, you guys choose.
Yeah. And what if this is a radical attempt of emptying, of kenosis?
Yeah.
Right. So he's trying to purge all these categories, all these premises. And if you read it in light of Genesis, that's also...
So are you saying that... So it is saying that if there's a kind of emptying, we talked about stripping, but kenosis would be a kind of act of negation. So the question is... So I have to ask you, is your sense, kenosis is usually an intentional action?
Mm-hmm.
So do you see this as a form of intentionality to subvert and undermine, or this is coming from another? It may be a stripping, but it's coming from a different place. I just want to sense how you've thought a lot, more than probably anybody in the room, about kenosis, but the question is, normally, theologically, it's an intentional act to negate language that gets in the way, or that its terminology. In other words, the positivity of language can focus you, but then you realize that it's a speed bump along the way, and you have to kind of strip it away to get to what that too is pointing to. In other words, language which appeared to be a representation now becomes a representation of nothing too. It's a representation of a representation. You have to kind of get beyond what first helped you think. Some kind of a God in positive terms may help you orient your thought in a certain way, but it's not just that. So I have to undermine precisely what helped me orient it for a deeper orientation. So are you saying that you think this is intentional or what?
But more I think emptying as a personal attempt, as his attempt to deal with suffering, right? Emptying in order to get rid of those categories, to reach that nothingness where...
Okay.
I mean, maybe I'm thinking more in Eastern terms.
It's interesting you say that, so let me just add one thing that maybe help the discussion going. I would have thought that it happens against your will. In other words, the very issue of rupture opens an abyss which becomes a negative vector. And it precedes intentionality. If that is also true to then these other things, then the language becomes a first order attempt to kind of deal from silence into the first level of language. And that first level of language retains the deep abyss of negation. That is to say, I wish the day didn't exist. I wish my mother's womb didn't exist. I wish light didn't exist. In other words, it carries the trace of the negative that came against one's will. So we've got a couple of very interesting things going on here. Whether when a person speaks in culture, the first thing that erupts saves culture or undermines culture, or whether in the abyss there is a disposition that's before intention, right? So I don't have an answer. I'm just opening that. I think that anybody wanted to pick up on these things or more? Yeah.
So between the relationship between language and suffering, I feel like chapter 3 is like a confession and and kind of the ultimate. It's as if until expressed through language, his suffering had not reached the pinnacle. He had not confessed the reality. But toward the end of chapter 3, he says that my groaning serves as my bread. My roaring pours forth as water. What I had feared has overtaken me. What I dreaded has come upon me. It's as if until expressed through language, this suffering had not reached its ultimate end. But then when expressed through language, that's when this suffering, in a very audible way, it kind of has like this relation. The language has a relationship with how he physically, submits to the ultimate state of suffering that he couldn't have, that he in some ways wanted to be pushing away before he expressed.
All right, so it's very interesting. All these three comments are very helpful. So, so the way you're articulating this is an articulation of suffering can be true to suffering because it deepens it in a way that one can reflect upon it. I can eat it as my bread. That can be morose and perverted. But what he's saying is, I can't know the depth of what I have endured unless I try at a minimal level to give it some words. Now, so all these things are all helpful. I would qualify one word that you used.
Please.
And maybe you use the word maybe just from your own confessional background or whatever. I personally would not speak of chapter 3 as a confession. I would prefer the genre of lament.
Can I articulate what I meant by
Yes,
confession?
yeah, and then I'll articulate what I mean by lament.
I think that by confession, I simply meant that he has resigned himself to hopelessness. When he says, "What I dreaded has come upon me," it's as if until this point, he has pushed it away because of this culture that has kind of held in high regard this possibility of hope. And by confession, what I meant was that he is maybe resignation. Maybe that would be a better word. I feel like he's in some way like turning to he's saying, okay, I can't do anything about it. It's overtaken. The culture is it's not helping me. My context is not the faculties, the resources that I have theologically are helping me. It's overtaking me, and here I am.
So it's interesting. You may be right. Obviously, when I use the term lament, see, I'm impressed in the first instance that he's not saying anything that my culture doesn't help me, my theology doesn't help me. He has turned there's a radical subjectivity. He is just we talk about like he's just his pain. There's that's what's impressing me. So let me say a word more about that and see whether people maybe enter this discussion of the four of us so far. I don't yet sense Job talking to the larger rationale of meaning that he had inherited. I read the first chapter as the first articulation of the radical subjectivity of pain. In other words, in subjectivity in the most literal of philological senses, he subjects himself to the totality of that pain. It's not an object to him, he subjects himself to it. He becomes a subject to it. And the reason I'm going to be emphasizing this is because I think that there is a kind of radicalization of subject and a radicalization of subjective consciousness that Job can't get rid of until God will speak to him at the end. Whether he's right or wrong, or whether it's right or wrong, that a person who undergoes something feels the black hole, which is that subjective absence, whether that's intentional or it just happens, that negative space. But Job is I-centered in the most ultimate sense. And maybe the first time you have to really come to terms with your tradition is when you really have to face that I that has to rebuild itself and wasn't just given to you by your parents or by tradition or by society. Now, something has to happen so that you're aware of the constructed nature of your theology, to talk in Chicago terms. In other words, it's not historical theology, you have to be aware that you're choosing or making or constructing something, and you begin that way only when there is this stripping. Whether that, we still haven't answered how Adrian is going to deal with that, but you see where I'm moving. So when I use that language, maybe we're saying the same thing, but when I use the word lament, there's a cultural genre of lament, which includes tearing your hair and ripping your clothes and wearing sackcloth and ashes and rolling in the dust and just saying woe. Woe is the genre of lament. Right? That is the encapsulated. Every other lament parses woe, or Hebrew oi. Right? In the Greek, the Y that appears in all these laments in the tragedies, there is some kind of a universal shriek that is metonymically the totality of lament. Everything else is a cultural articulation of that. That's part of what I was wondering when we're saying, if the oi, or the woe, is the deep structure, then is that next language, it's formal, but does it still stay connected to the woe? Right? Or can you say that language and you have not yet gotten to the woe? Right? That was, I think, part of what we were wondering at the very beginning. I don't think there's any one truth to this, and there's probably multiple truths depending on who you are. So I'm not saying there's one phenomenal truth to this. I'm trying to use the text and thinking to try to wonder about this, and obviously I have some thoughts about it, but it doesn't mean that. Now before we get to the friends, which maybe help us see that in context, is there anything more people would want to say about the negation, the formality, the structure, the confessionality, the lament quality, the abyss place that is filled with something that helps us? Anything more about Job in consciousness? Job becomes a figure for a type of consciousness, right? Insofar as we want to identify with Job, we're trying to understand a certain type of paradigmatic consciousness. And it becomes a little bit problematic for us because we're already seeing it's a moving character. You're not going to be sure exactly what you have, but we're trying to get something about this. Yeah.
First of all, he's only talking in words. There's no action here, number one. We only have words. Up until now we've had action. So it seems to me that language is an immediate response to the physical action that took before. Secondly, it seems to me that the language that he's using is lost the element of gratitude for what he had received. Just gone. He before this time was a guy who said, God gave, God took. Now it's just, I'm in real bad shape. Thirdly, he has constructed very metaphorical language, which isn't the way someone reacts when they're in enormous pain. It's a very formal, constructive response that allows one to create a structure to give one solace that is separate and apart from the pain that he's feeling. One does not talk this way in metaphors. I don't know anybody who is going through a real deep time who starts giving very detailed night-like metaphors in darkness. So why is he doing this? It seems to me he's doing this because by constructing such a metaphor, he is in effect dissipating his pain, diluting it, by converting it to a structure that in effect gives him solace from its creation that is totally unrelated to his pain.
All right. So that's a point that we're going to have to think about. Whether, obviously, metaphors we understand to be a more elevated form of complex speech or condensed speech. The question for me, in response to what you're saying, is that understood, that metaphors are not the first level we might think. The question is whether that serves pain better by its condensation of logic than normal syntax would do. That would be the literary question for me. So I agree that at the level of literary theory, metaphor stands several steps away. You have to have statement X and statement Y, and X is like Y, and then you lose the like when the things come together. So it's a series of complicated mental moves. The question can still be, in a lament, whether a poet can use that to collapse some density that forces you to feel rather than to think. Right? That metaphors become imagistic pulses that force you to feel before you think. Because in some cases, metaphors are illogical. Right? They bring together odd things. And these issues of pain are precisely the aporia of what doesn't make sense. So let's at least, it's a helpful point, and let's just see. So now before we, so we have a person who's in pain, who has fallen into an abyss of silence, into an abyss of subjectivity, and speaks out. However we define that genre. Anybody want to say anything more about that before we turn to the friends? Yeah.
This is not developed at all, but I just want to quibble with this idea that metaphor is this complex series of logical moves with simile as its origin. There's been some work in philosophy of language. I'm thinking of Max Black's essay, which I haven't read in years, but he troubles this notion that simile is kind of the ancestor ghost behind a metaphor. That rather, metaphor is an entirely different way of looking at reality. One thing becomes the grid through which you look at the other thing. There is no equal sign that you first sort of sat with and then decided didn't work and dropped. So you could think of suffering as moving you into this new way of knowing, where suddenly things become grids through which you see other things. So the metaphor, in contrast to what you're suggesting, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Steve.
Steve. In contrast to what you're suggesting, Steve, metaphor might be a sort of extra logical, immediate way of speaking, because the suffering provides a new lens through which to view events. I don't know if that made sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Anybody want to respond to what Olivia's saying? Just in more general terms, yeah.
Well, I would respond from a more like pragmatic after spending a summer in the hospital.
Yeah, nice and loud, okay.
Sorry, and this summer, spending a summer in a hospital with people who are constantly in pain and ill, and the amount of metaphorical language they do use to try and communicate with doctors any sense of pain, so the doctors can diagnose. There's it's full of simile, it's full of metaphor. So my perspective would be a more pragmatic one of people who are in pain are full of metaphors because it's very difficult to communicate, particularly bodily pain. So that's where I would come from as well.
You guys are saying the same thing from
Right.
different,
Yeah.
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 In fact, you're coming from a deeper place than where Olivia was
Yeah.
saying, but you're saying the same thing. Yeah, nice. Anybody else want to respond to any of that from your reading or experience? All right, well, let's bear that in mind. Before we move on, Adrian, do you have any other reflections on intentionality on that point, or do you want to just let it go for the time being? Okay, it's a very complicated issue. I'm also very concerned with this issue of intentionality here, and trying to figure out whether there are types of dispositions that precede intention in a deeper way. So we'll come back to Job, but let's, before we do that next step. That is to say, what would be some kind of overall literary phenomenology of the discourse of the friends? Let's say, we don't have to go into depth yet of Eliphaz, which we will, but friends speaking to a friend. Is there something different phenomenologically or language-wise that's going on here that we should at least spell out, or that occurred to you before we come closer to the issue? All right, so let me get the ball rolling. I'm sure you have all these thoughts in your head. So obviously, the most primary thing, it's not my pain. It's your pain. I am a beholder of pain. I may have empathy or not empathy. That will be a question of how a person responds. But in the first instance, I didn't go through this. I must say, I just, in parentheses, a little confession. I had an experience last week in synagogue. You read the text, and it's very powerful. And you sort of don't see something that was there that is the powerful trigger. And the moment that happened, so I belong to a fairly small synagogue, so the fact that there were two people who had this experience together was even more magnified. So there was a person who had just come back from Israel because his son had died. Okay? So when I came to the synagogue and I saw him, first of all, there was this flash of the Job, the unnaturalness of mourning for a son or a daughter. It's not natural, right? It's not the natural way that life happens. Fathers and mothers shouldn't mourn for sons and daughters in the natural course of life, right? And I had somehow didn't feel the way I should have felt when I read that chapter that he lost his children. It was like language to me, and I had forgotten the horror of that, right? I read past it. And then the most amazing thing happened right after that. There's another person in the synagogue whose son had committed suicide. You probably know the person who had challenged MIT with access to public information. So his father, his son, was there. Precisely the perversion of the moral support of society to have public information, also for the poor. And this boy, Aaron, had committed suicide. And his father, during this year, is also mourning. So this is a small community, and Aaron's father walks in 2 minutes after this other person had just recited what's Kaddish, which is the prayer of magnification of God's name that a mourner recites. And I was just facing that situation. He walks into the door, and he hadn't expected to see this other person. And he sees him, and he grabs him, and the two fathers stop to sob. It was this kind of overwhelming human moment, but you don't quite realize what was going on in Job. It's not a literary text, right? So you have to kind of remember that pathos. We have a lot of silence. You don't see the tears. You see a lot of attempts at parental fortitude, right? Attempts at parental fortitude. Even when we say God has given, God has taken away, maybe a lot more complicated than Kierkegaard would like to say it, right? But the perversity of the human species that was represented doubly of fathers crying for sons and two fathers crying over sons. And it had nothing to do with theological protest, right? There was neither of them were making theological statements. If anything, when I asked the first father how it was, so in a sense, he couldn't talk, and his wife is devastated, but he said the community was supporting. So the theological issue wasn't an issue. The community was supporting. He said the community is amazing. These things you sometimes hear a lot. And it's an interesting counterpoint, right? Because we're going to get to the consolation of friends. Because the community was just providing meals and presents. They weren't providing words. They were providing the possibility that in the perversity of the rupture of the normal sequence of living, there is a world that you could go back to, right? Something like that. Because that's part, isn't it, of what the friends, the consolers, would represent. They represent the world that is a witness to the tragedy, right? And we have to really feel that to say, did the friends speak rightly? What do you say when you are an eyewitness to sorrow and you have not had the sorrow that cuts your heart out, right? Even empathy doesn't cut your heart out. But fathers that cry over sons, that's a sorrow that cuts your heart out. Right? So, presumably, the friends would know that. It's not just that they see his body as an expression of that pain, right? That's the way the text wants to deal with it. Like, it had all become somaticized, as it were, in his body. But it's just the way that the text is saying that he looked unnatural, right? When he's peeling his boils, it's only to say he's not a natural person anymore. He's a person who has experienced unnatural horror. So we have to also remember, and that was the boomerang experience in the synagogue. And that one is required, when one looks at Job, is to say, what does a witness do? What does a witness do? Now, the first thing the witnesses do is they kept silent. But what also does a witness do when the sufferer speaks? Does one mirror that in some way? Do they mirror, or they do something else? So that's the first point that I would want to make as we try to really get at this. For Job, it's before theology. He is not speaking theology yet. He is experiencing the pain of loss. Real loss, right? It's a bloodletting. It's a draining, right? So when you say he doesn't wish he wasn't, it's as if he's watching his lifeblood flow out of him, which was the lifeblood that allowed him to live with people. And that would allow him to be numb of pain. Right? So this is something very real here. Right? It's not just a literary text, but we want to see these relationships. So that's the first thing, at least for me, that he doesn't talk theology. He talks what it means to be a frail, mortal person who has experienced a horror. Right? What do the species do? They want to continue. Right? What is the ideal in the Bible? You should see your children and your children's children. Right? In other words, multiple generations. That's the ideal. Your children and your children's children, so that you know that there is symbolic immortality, that there is continuity. Right? To see your children's children is precisely a sense of future. So now if the children die before you do, what is there? Right? That is what he's lost. He's lost future in every possible sense. Right? This is something big. Right? That's what I think he is. That is the language of the oi, of the woe, of the lament, related to all the things that you guys have said. But that's part of where it's coming from. So then there's a second. So there are also limits to empathy. Right? There are limits to empathy. And the consoler has to know that, I think. Right? Now, what does that mean in the phenomenological terms we've been talking about? If Job becomes an expression of subjectivity, friendship is an archetype of intersubjectivity. Right? And its limits. Intersubjectivity doesn't mean that I can know you or you know me. Something has to pass between the two of us. And if the language is not right, there's a new rupture. Right? So we're partially now talking about, in the framework of intersubjectivity, what does language do? If the language of subjectivity in its first radical moment is the I and the subject and the pain, how different is it not when Eliphaz, whose language we're going to look at momentarily, speaks for some form, he speaks rhetoric and argument. He speaks from an a priori. The a priori is some sense that had existed, right? Job is an a posteriori sufferer. It's after the suffering, right? The friends have an a priori. They have a matrix. They have something through which they want to talk about the meaning of the world. And they want to bring him back into their matrix. Not just bring him back into the world, right? Because all you'd have to do for that is to hug a person. Right? That's all you'd have to do. But they don't just hug. They don't just express fellow, or the hug can be, I give you my coat, I give you my food. Right? Right? I give you my creatureliness in some sense. But they don't. They give him some words which are based on their sense of meaning. And as we'll see towards the end, he says, hey, Job, you can trust me. I'm one of the wise. I have empirical experience. Charkanuha, we have investigated all of this, and we know it.
And we have data.
Right? Right? We have a database. We have a database of suffering. Right? We've got a tradition. We've got many types of experiences beyond what you have gone through. So get off. Get off it. Get off of your subjectivity. Right? There's a bigger picture. And so that first level is a different kind. It comes from an a priori place of something that's in their head that doesn't come from the place of his suffering. And it becomes intersubjective. They want to, well-meaning perhaps, but they want to give him a gift. But what kind of a gift are they giving? In the best sense, they're trying to give him a gift. But what is the gift? Yeah. Mary.
I just wanted to figure out, and I'm trying to get a sense of what you're meaning by subjectivity, and I'm thinking about, in chapter 3 we saw, it's even if it's a lament or whatever we want to call it, some sort of giving form to his suffering, externalizing through words something, whether it's what it is, we're not quite sure what it sounds like.
Yeah.
But in contrast to what Eliphaz is doing, would you see Job as objectifying or creating form to his suffering so that he can sort of stand before it for himself, or is it a form of intersubjectivity?
So you tell me, help me think about it.
I mean,
that's nice. You help me think about it. Help us think about it. No.
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to understand is it something, is his lament for himself so that he can sort of create a certain sort of
who's he speaking to?
I'm not sure. I think to himself in a way, or just sort of out. I'm not sure he's speaking to his friends. In that sense, then maybe it is a sort of, but it's interesting to think that he's creating the speech for himself so that he can stand before it in a way that, but we're saying that Eliphaz is more trying to bring him back into a matrix. And it's just interesting to think about, I don't know, it's not great.
All right, so that first kind of language would be, in a certain sense, breaks the frame. Because his life, the frame has been broken, right? And so there's an attempt to help him by giving him a frame. The question is whether that frame will be helpful or sensible, or it addresses him. As we will see, Job keeps coming back to the fact of his own subjective knowledge and experience. He keeps coming back to that, right? Don't hit me over the head with theological generalizations. In other words, that is the new moment of the rebuilding of a theological world. If it's going to work, it has to be honest to my experience. Right?
The question
So
is,
that-
how do you get that honesty conveyed to someone else?
Right. So, yeah, I think that this is a major cultural moment. Even we talked about the axial age and the issues of movement to subjectivity. We're talking about cultures that think through the community. And all of a sudden, a voice is emerging through this text, which is representing the culture, that there is radical personhood that is thinking through personal experience and not through inherited tradition. That's a very, but this is where our situation is. Yeah.
Well, the challenge to something you said earlier, the I that has to rebuild itself. In fact, every I has to rebuild itself. How do you inhabit and inherit a tradition? You can only do it by rebuilding yourself into it. And suffering is a radical opportunity, in a way, to rebuild yourself into a tradition. That's one point. The second is, I keep reminding myself, remembering Dante. And that's another moment of everything is falling apart, dissolving. But nobody talks to him. Beatrice doesn't come down and give him a pep talk. But he has to experience, right, a lengthy, tedious detour through the inferno and the purgatory. So it's not language that does it there. Why? It's puzzling. Why didn't just Beatrice or someone come down and talk to him? Hey, let me get you out of this dark forest. In that case, language, maybe he was already beyond that possibility. But I think coming back to Job, it's that insufficiency which probably the friends are not aware of. Language cannot achieve that reality, bringing the person down, bringing Job back.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And what occurs to me as you're saying that is, it may be that language could work and it works for the friends. But there is a rhythm that has been set in motion by Job's suffering that has its own logic, psychologic, spiritual logic. And even if that language is right, if it's at the wrong time, it doesn't work. So it may be that there may be a theological explanation that could work, but if it's not at the right time, timing is everything. Because the language has to fit itself in to the timing of the inner world. And that's also part of the difference, is it not, between Job and his friends. It's the difference between an inner world and a viewed world. Right? The inner world of Job and the speech that comes out of that inner world, and the viewed world that is represented by the friends. They're representing, making present in this moment something that had been prior in some way. And it doesn't cut it. It doesn't work because Job's breathing is different. It's a breathing from pain. It's not a breathing from thought. The friends breathe from thought. Job breathes from pain. And that one is interior. And the friends don't feel, they can't see, but they don't feel the interior. Right? Olivia.
In that regard, though, I want to return to what Sarah Jo was saying. I really like the image she gave us of Job speaking in order to externalize his suffering so that he can reflect on it. I mean, whether or not that's what's going on, I think that's an interesting idea to think with for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So if Job sort of laments, and the lamentation is there for him to sort of reflect on, and it's there for him to think with, even if he's not. So you've just set up this dichotomy between the friends who are using thought and Job who isn't having pain. But Job has sort of put all of these questions out there to move through. And the friends want to shut down that process, especially Bildad. It's like, how long are you going to say these crazy things? Stop. And, you know, even though they're speaking from a place of viewing the suffering, and even if they're using first order language that's, you know, more logical or whatever, they're actually shutting down the process of thought and thinking with suffering. Is that about anxiety? Are they anxious? These questions that Job has given them to ponder, they don't want to think through those questions with him. What is that about?
So you remember the point, whether it fully answers that, but you also responded last class to the point of Philippe Nemo, and his point was the horror of what they see forces them back into types of rationality. They can't let themselves see the world that Job has experienced.
And they can't entertain the paths of thought that horror invites them to think about. They can't go there.
Because what that would mean, and as what you have to explore, is that all narratives break down. Even the great traditional narrative. Job represents the breakdown of the narrative. In the first instance, in a pre-conscious way. It will become articulated. So the friends do what people in tradition do. They are commentators. They're interpreters of experience based on some prior authoritative thing, whether that is language or oral tradition, right? So they're commenting on it. They're giving a gloss or an explanation as if Job is a kind of exegetical expression of something that is a prior narrative. They're speaking as commentators, as exegetes. It's a talking cure. They're trying the talking cure. And Job doesn't want to be a text for commentary. Right? It's a primary... In fact, there is no text yet for commentary. That is, in fact, possibly what that lament is. Right? Because if he doesn't want to be born and he subverts the language of Genesis, that is the most primary of all narratives. That there is some structure to the universe. We're not even talking about divine providence for suffering. The most primary narrative is natural coherence, the coherence of the natural world. But that is precisely what the death of children for parents is, that there's no coherence to the natural world. Right? That parents grow and they have children and the children grow. Right? Roots sink into the earth and they produce fruit. Right? And then that's natural. Right? Right? So that's something really strong. Anybody want to add anything more before we look at the text itself? We're trying to develop some way of having read through the text, now thinking about it now, I'm going to go back and work with that language. How does the biblical hermeneutics, its own language, talk about this? So let's turn to Eliphaz. And let's begin this process. Let's begin firstly with the first 5 lines of his speech. And we'll get some different translations going and see what he has to say. So who'd like to just read? Let's begin. And just really attend. I want to do part of the Eliphaz. I did a couple of things of Job. Maybe we do the part of the Bildad. That'll give us something to chew on. So let's start with Mr. Eliphaz. So, yeah, please.
Then Eliphaz the Temanite said in reply, "If one ventures a word with you, will it be too much? But who can hold back his words? See, you have encouraged many. You have strengthened failing hands. Your words have kept him who stumbled from falling. You have braced knees that gave way. But now that it overtakes you, it is too much. It reaches you, and you are unnerved."
One more line, maybe.
Oh. Is not your piety your confidence, your integrity your hope?
Okay, now let me just read Shendlin, just so that you hear another translation. Eliphaz the Temanite then took up the argument and said, "Might one try a word with you, or would you tire? But who could hold back words now? You were always the one to instruct the many, to strengthen failing hands. Your words would pick up men who had fallen and firm up buckling knees. Yet now it is your turn, and you go faint. It has reached you, and you are undone. Isn't your innocence some reassurance?" Or he translates innocence, but it's really your piety. JPS has the piety, but it's yiratcha, which is your reverence. Something, because he's alluding back to the fact that he was fearful or reverent of God. He's alluding back to that opening statement of who he was. Doesn't your righteousness offer you hope? And making a segue into verse 6, although it begins the next. So let's look at it carefully and slowly as we begin. What do you see here? What, in a certain sense, he sounds a little bit like Satan, right? Doesn't he? You get stuck with it, and he'll curse you to your face. It's an ironic background here, right? But so let's take him at his word. He is a friend. He is an attempt to be a comforter. So how does he look, what are the hermeneutics here? How does this express itself? I want to hear from you.
It seems a little bit like a backhanded compliment.
In what sense?
Like, oh, you were so good at this for all of us, but now that it's happened to you, like, you should be stronger.
Okay. What is the accusation is that it was external theology, it wasn't really internalized. The stuff couldn't keep you on balance in the storm. There's an irony here. There's a difference between what you said to others. He's speaking, now the friend is speaking to him. There's a difference between what you say to others and what really was an inner truth that could help you. So already the inner and the outer is being addressed. You spoke a language of comfort which has no comfort to you. Right? You're internally empty, even though you had the language on your lips. Okay, what else? Okay. We're trying to get at really what is he saying to him?
It's a straightforward challenge in a way.
Yeah.
What does it mean to actually have those things internalized? Things you preach and help others. How do you apply to yourself? What do you do when you are in that situation? You are put in that predicament. So it's
So he's really saying to him that your inner strength was no inner strength. In other words, if you're on the outside, you can talk all kinds of crap. Right? You can say all kinds of theological stuff. Right?
Saying follow your own advice.
Yeah. But it was not real knowledge. It wasn't real theology yet. Right? Notice how he starts. He meets him at the level of speech and breath. It's as if in this hermeneutical expression, Job had now filled the space with this language of lament and crisis. Right? And his first statement is to say, can you just hold your breath long enough to listen? Can you listen to something else? That's how he begins. You are so filled with the exhaling of your pain. Can you stop? And he says the opposite. Your screech of breath has made me hold my breath. You've overwhelmed me. But I'm going to speak out in any case. In other words, he's going to say, you've made me stop because it's just a blast of air. And if I were to wait for you to stop, perhaps I couldn't get a word in edgewise. So the friend is saying, but what you've said to me means I have to respond back in words. So there's something already that's real to Eliphaz. He has to speak. And then that first speech, again, is not yet theology. He's saying that your own integrity is a weak integrity. your theology is not internalized. Okay. What kind of words are that you say to a suffering person? What is he saying to him?
As I was reading the text, I guess that I wasn't hearing Eliphaz. I've read it a couple times, but I could have just completely missed it. I wasn't hearing Eliphaz reprimanding Job, but I was hearing him as it seemed to me, as someone who saw himself prior to this moment as a spiritual or pious inferior to Job, and that by virtue of hearing Job in this lament, his own faith is weakened, and he's wondering if he can get Job to recant. And if he does get Job to recant, then his own faith will be, or his own understanding, his own narrative will be salvaged. I don't know if that's can be considered, but
all right.
It doesn't seem to me that he's not saying, I don't see him saying like, you have no integrity, you have no piety. I'm hearing him say, what wasn't it your piety that was your confidence, and your integrity? Isn't that your hope, and isn't that still there, and can't that be salvaged?
In part, I think that is helpful. There's a great ambiguity in 4:6, and the commentators don't help me resolve it. And I think it goes in two different directions. I'm not sure how to understand it. So let me give you the two possibilities based on the Hebrew. One is that Job is a victim of his own self-deceit. When he challenges Job, is not your piety your hope? He's saying, you've deluded yourself with a certain sense of piety that doesn't allow you to see things as they are, which is that all people are sinful and are mortal. By which he really means, he has to use the language of sin, because that's just in the book vernacular, but it doesn't mean original sin. He simply means that the human species can never be in full alignment with the divine will, and suffering is a larger expression of that. But you are so filled with your sense of righteousness that you can't allow yourself to see that aspect of your mortal fragility, that you are a sinner in the sense that you're part of this deep, broken fabric of things under heaven. Even the angels can't get it right. So you've got yourself, there's a delusion. That's one possibility. The other possibility of reading that verse, and again, I'm not sure what's right, and they may both go together, is he says to him, perhaps your very sense of innocence is your hope. That is to say, you did not die with your sons. That should be, paradoxically, the proof that sinners or people who do things wrong will be punished. And if a person can get it right, that is some kind of a sign that should be your hope that this theology is working, right? But I don't think that Eliphaz understands that Job was speaking from his subjective pain. He had not yet talked about suffering and punishment and my kids must have sinned, even though I tried to keep it all together for them. They must have done something. And in the karmic balance of things, they're going to get it. Right? Now, there's a kind of real deep karmic balance that God affects in the world, as it were. And that sin has a way of working itself out in one way or another. It just doesn't lie there. It's a logic that will express itself somehow in disaster. I'm not sure which way that it has to go in this particular case. Whether he has deceived himself that I'm innocent and therefore there is a divine injustice, or the very fact that he is alive is a sign of that very truth. Later on, when Eliphaz and Bildad will say that you should do something with your sense of suffering, it's as if they are saying, in the light of this theology, the very fact that you are experiencing pain under these circumstances is a sign that even for you, there's something not absolutely perfect in your head and your action. And that you should then use that as a trigger to confession and repentance. It's as if they're saying, if you had your spiritual act together, you would not be experiencing this pain. Now, your children sinned at one level, and so the karmic balance has to work out with death. There's some kind of a balancing thing that goes on. The scales have to be readjusted somehow. And this is a kind of rebalancing. Whatever that sin meant in this kind of a universe. But he's then saying, the very fact that you are so agitated means that your spiritual life has a rupture in it. And that you should see that as some kind of taint in your spiritual life. That is the punishment that you're getting. Your agitation over sorrow is a sign that you are not spiritually whole. Right? And that you should then repent. Now, at one level, we all respond, that makes some sense, but in another sense, that's an outrageous statement. It's outrageous. Right? As many religious leaders will say, well, use your suffering and reflect on what's happening and use this as a chance of self-correction. Right? But his outrage is based on his sense of who he thinks he is. And the question is, Has he been deceiving himself? Right? He can't really come to terms with himself. Because we already see that there's something that people can't always be sure what they're doing. That's why he's correcting his kids. So he's aware that that is a component of his own behavior, perhaps. There are things that you do and you have to... So that's part of this first issue. And then he speaks for this fact that upright persons don't... Where have the upright perished? I see plowing wickedness. I see men plowing wickedness and harvesting trouble. So he's trying to speak to some right balance in the world. Right? And he's introducing something new in Job's experience. Job was experiencing pain and loss of his children. And now he is introducing something that at one level is an outrageous theological claim. They were sinners. They got what they deserved. And that the righteous don't suffer. Right? So he's trying to make a statement based on theological and worldly experience. But it's an outrageous statement. Because how does he know? How does he know? So now he's going to tell us how he thinks he knows. Because part of the underlying issue here with the friends is who knows best about their experience? Does the sufferer, or does the person who has other kinds of privileged knowledge based on tradition or something else? So now he turns to something quite different in chapter 4, beginning verse 12. Someone want to read from 12 on. Yes.
Now a word came stealing to me. My ear received the whisper of it. Amid thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on mortals, dread came upon me, and trembling which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh bristled. I stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. Can mortals be righteous before God? Can human beings be pure before their Maker? Even in his servants, he puts no trust. In his angels, he charges with errors. How much more those who live in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth? Between morning and evening, they are destroyed. They perish forever without any regarding it. Their tenth cord is plucked up within them, and they die devoid of wisdom.
Okay. So it's very interesting that he first talks to Job that you can't make assessments based on your own experience. And then he appeals to another order of knowledge. It's really almost the only time before we get to Elihu towards the end, and before we have the notion of God's revelation, that we have any form of divine communication. One of the forms, as we'll see to anticipate with Elihu will say something not like, what Eliphaz will be saying, but Elihu will say, just to anticipate, pay attention to your dreams. There's something in the turbulence of dream that helps you understand something of sorrow. So he will speak positively that if Job had been paying attention to his dream, he would have realized that the desire for rational order is not so clean. Dreams are some kind of reflection of the turbulence of the inner world, and that one's judgment about things should be a little bit more restrained. We haven't got there yet. But there will be a notion that dreams are privileged places of communication, even at the natural level. That you realize that you're filled with complicated emotional experiences, and then you should be a little bit more hesitant about how you speak and make judgments about the world. It's an inner sign for you. Now, Eliphaz, we're not there yet. Because Elihu is saying, you already had this at the natural level. You should have been a little bit more humble about your assertions. Because you can't be so full of pride that you understand your own inner motivations. Things are going on at a deeper level. If you paid attention to your own inner life, you would see that you're a little bit of a mess. Now, Eliphaz is doing something else. He's saying that he had some kind of divine visitation at night. And it was a spiritual horror. Okay? It was a terrifying experience. Okay? It was a terrifying experience. Even at night, he could feel the hair stand up in the back of his neck. That's what the text says. Goosebumps, and the hair was sticking up in the back of his neck. Because he experienced the Elai Davar Yugunav. Some kind of a divine word was stolen and brought into my consciousness. It was brought from another space that filled me with terror in the night. And what was it? I had a dream vision with the manifestation of a voice. The voice of real radical silence. He's playing on the language of Elijah. Right? There was the thin voice of silence. It's the same terms. So he says to him, and the voice says, and we're going to see this type of rhetorical question repeats itself in the book of Job. So this is the voice within the divine voice in his head in his dream. As he is, because it's interesting that Eliphaz is first saying, you have nothing inside. You don't have your presumption of innocence is a false presumption. Moreover, humans are incapable of perfection. Humans are incapable of perfection. Which, that the world is, at the human level, is filled with human error. And human error leads to disaster, which is understood as divine punishment. Right? There is some kind of deep logic of human frailty. And to expect that things are going to go in a certain kind of way that you comfort others, that everything will be fine, is not based on reality, and he's saying it's not based on the theological truth. So he has this voice coming down from heaven, as it were, saying to him, can a human being be justified before God? A priest, right? Is there any commensurability between the human and the divine? So the human could even make a claim that I didn't deserve something. Right? Let's get his argument as strong as possible. Ha'enosh me'alo ha'yitzdak. Can a human being be justified before God? Can you make a justifiable claim before heaven? It's not yet to say that God acts, that the act of God is just. But he says, can you as a human being make a justifiable claim that I'm an innocent person? That I don't deserve what I got? That I make a claim of justification of what I did in relationship to the life that has been given to me? Right? That's part of what's saying, that I live one kind of life, I inherit the whirlwind, and I say, this is I speak out against God. He said, what? How can you do such a thing? Right? You can't begin to open your mouth, because he says, can a human being be justified? Can a person be pure before their Creator? Right? There are different orders, he's saying, of magnitude. God doesn't even trust his divine servants. So how much the more so could a mortal person who crumbles into the dust make a claim of self-justification? Very strong argument, right? He's saying that you're a deceived person, right? That you have not yet got to a place of radical humility. Right? Job's answer, as we'll see, is I can only trust. I am indeed immortal. But I have to, if I'm going to proceed with any integrity, I have to trust myself and my experience. Okay? You see the aporeic, or the disjunction here. The consoler is trying to say, the human has no right to make any claim upon existence. There's no claim that you could make to justify yourself before the Creator, because you are just a mortal person. You are just a creature of clay. You're not even an angel, and even angels are not perfected. Right? So for you to wish to make a claim of innocence, but don't forget, he's never even yet made that claim of innocence. There's a kind of presumption. All Job did was screech out, I wish I was dead. But Eliphaz is interpreting that cry is, I have no right to experience this pain of loss because of because of the life I lived. This already changes there's a different order of theological concern here, right? Notice what in fact is being stated in poetic terms. I think it's quite an amazing shift. Because at one level you say, the kids may have sinned and they're being punished for their sin. And the argument of Eliphaz to Job, picking up on Job's lament or cry in chapter 3, is to say, he's interpreting as if Job said, I shouldn't have to have endured this pain because I'm an innocent person. It's a different statement. Notice, he is transferring this from what his sons and children may have done, and then he is personalizing it, and he's saying, but I should not have to have the pain of sorrow if I was a good person. Right? And it's as if Eliphaz is saying, that is crazy. Right? Because you too are a mortal person. Right? And all mortal persons are fragile and sin, therefore they experience pain. And that's somehow related to what you're experiencing with your kids. Right? It's not as if you're perfected and you should expect that you wouldn't be. This is as it were, is part of the punishment of your mortal fragility. Right? It's not a clear, logical argument, but you see that he has changed terms.
From the children.
And then he goes on in chapter 5. Let me just... and he says something that's very interesting in chapter 5. So he says, you can scream with outrage, but who will answer? Fools, this is an argument that is an unanswerable argument. God is not going to respond to this. There is something much larger he's suggesting. And then there's a very interesting line which I'd like to hear how you respond to, beginning in 5:5. So let me just read that. Now the hungry dine on his harvest, while he has to scrabble for it among thorns. And thirsty men gulp his wealth. Remember, evil does not emerge from the soil, or trouble sprout from the ground. Man, the human, was born to trouble, as sparks fly or dart to the sky. What is he saying here? What is he saying? What do you think he's saying? Don't forget, it's within the context of his larger argument of the frailty of the human species. And humans produce, it's not as if things just happen. Things happen because humans screw up the world. Right? He says, evil does not emerge from the soil, or trouble sprout from the ground. Man was born to trouble as sparks dart to the sky. He's saying that there is some kind of a deep human component in the evil that people have produced in their own life. Right? There is a deep human sorrow. And there's a deep human woe that the trouble that you reap is part of the trouble that the human species has introduced. And then he says that one should simply accommodate themselves to God. That he turns to God. He introduces, from verse 8 on, a theology of divine majesty. And he introduces this very interesting theology of majesty. He says, I entrust my affairs to God, who makes things great beyond human grasp, wonders beyond numbering, puts the rain on the face of the earth, sends water to countryside. And this God also somehow counteracts the will to power. He not only is the God of the perfection of nature, but he prevents the powerful from trampling the poor, the scheming from outwitting the meek, makes the schemer's plot seem like rashness, saves the poor from the knife. Where he gets that, we don't know. But he's claiming that's something of the divine majesty. There's something that God keeps the natural order together, and he keeps some kind of a balance within the social order. Right? That's his claim. So he says, happy is the person that God reproves, that you should take your pain and do something with it. He gives pain, and he brings healing. Right? So do something with your pain. Turn to God. And then he says, and then things will be good for you in the end. Right? He's trying to lift him into another matrix of thought. A human being is a frail sinner, has no hope of self-justification. So turn to the larger divine rhythm and accommodate yourself to this natural theology. This natural theology is the true rhythm. Notice that what is the goodness of God? The goodness of God is the natural order. Things grow. He claims that the goodness of God is that the meek will survive and schemers will be punished. So he says, that's the ultimate truth of things. Give yourself over to that. And if you should say to Job, how do you know? Job should say to him, how do you know that? He now gives this second level of authority. The first kind of authority was the authority of a revelation. The second type of authority is at the end of 5. We have studied and know it. Think it over and take it to heart. So there are 3 things here. He has said, first of all, is the language of we. There is a larger empirical study of human experience that we have accumulated. And you can't make a theology out of your subjective pain. So he's speaking to some larger empirical balancing that goes on in the universe. Notice that this is a human projection based on collective inference. It's not being based, we're not saying it says the Bible told me so. There's not a theological revelational claim. He is counteracting one natural theological inference with another. Job's inference was based on his own experience. And the friends are saying that there is a bigger picture. And there's a picture that so he's raising a very powerful question. He's saying, can you trust communal experience? Can you trust the wisdom of the past generations? Can you trust wisdom? Because what is wisdom? It's accumulated wisdom from the ages. You can't start all over again as if nothing had happened up to this point. So he's raising a certain kind of theological problem to the Job who wants to rebuild his life from sorrow. He's saying to Job, there is an accumulated cultural memory that has been struggling to deal with sorrow before your sorrow. And this is the framework that we've come up with. So suspend your personal judgment, which is based on arrogance, which is based on your sense of the arrogance of innocence, and realize that you are part of the tainted fabric of human life, the mortal, decaying, dying fabric of human life, which is part of some kind of larger divine rhythm. And that there is, just as God waters the earth, there's a kind of ultimate balancing. The balancing has a certain kind of truth, and you don't see it in your life, but this is a larger balancing. So he's asking him to shift his consciousness. Right? He says, as for me, I would edrosh, I would seek God. Right? He's saying, shift from the presumption that the subjective mind makes a claim on the universe and can make a claim against the universe. And put yourself into a divine framework. Now, he only said that I could swallow that pretty easily too. But he goes beyond simply saying there's a natural order to things, and that the fact that crops keep growing means that God sustains the world. He's saying that there's also a certain kind of moral sustenance, that the screwball gets screwed. Right? And that the cunning will get it in the end, and that God somehow doesn't let power go berserk. So he's making all kinds of presumptions, and he's making on the basis of that. So the challenge now is to say, are there limits to the argument from human experience? Or should you take this kind of long or divine view of things? Okay. Now, what I want to do in the time that's remaining is turn to one part of Job's argument that I think is extremely powerful, that will get us to chapter 7. In chapter 6, he says you can't even, he's going to turn back to his private speech. In 6 he says, you can't even weigh the rage of my pain. If my disaster can't even fit into a balance, it would overwhelm the world. For Shaddai's arrows are around me. My breath absorbs their venom. Terror of the God invests me. Don't give me this malarkey about an orderly divine universe. I experience the terror inside me. Right? Don't give me a theological framework when I experience the implosion of meaning in my heart. That's a lot of Huey. You're talking about big framework, and I'm talking about the terror in my being. And I feel the terror. I taste the terror. Right? Is that a wild ass braying over his grass, an ox bellowing? Who can eat unsalted food? What flavor is there in the drool of malice? What kind of a meal of consolation are you giving me? It's tasteless. I can't swallow it. It's worth. Notice he's using these images because he's trying to convey the distaste of what he's hearing. I can't absorb it. I can't swallow it. It's not nourishing. I have no appetite to touch them. They are nauseous as my flesh. Because he says, I've never suppressed the Holy One's commands. So I want to just die. Don't give me the sense I have to change my mental attitude. I just want it to be over. So he speaks for death. And then he speaks against friends. Let's just read this, and then I want to read one incredible subversive narrative. But let's just read 6:15 through 20, where we have the speech against the friends. Who'd like to read that? Where it begins, as for my friends. Yeah.
On your skin did not look at me, like a wadi running dry, or like a wave that passed by me. Those who held me in respect have now fallen on me like snow, or like solid ice. Just as melted with heat coming on, it was not recognized for what it was. So I too was abandoned by all, and I perished and became homeless. Look at the roads of the Thamanites, the paths of the Sabaeans, you who see so clearly. They also will incur shame with their confidence in cities and wealth. But yet you too trod on me without mercy, so that now you have seen my hurt. Be afraid.
Okay, let me give you a different translation too, and then we'll talk about it. And again, this relates to this issue, just like we saw the use of images about the taste of false pablum, of healing. Now he's going to talk about the friends with these images. As for my friends, they failed me like a riverbed, wandered off like water in a wadi, gloomy on an icy day, covered up with snow. They flow one moment, they're gone. When it is hot, they flicker away. Their dry courses twist, wander into wasteland, vanish. Caravans from Tema appear. Sabian trains move toward them hoping. Disappointment for their trust. They reach them, find frustration. That is how you are to me. You see terror. Take fright yourself. What is the argument against the friends?
That they're not taking his lived experience seriously. They're just sort of discounting it in favor of this accumulated wisdom.
Yeah. And how about the images that they're using? how does that help him convey that? Because he didn't say it the way you said it.
Right.
So, what is he? How is he trying to stick it to them through images? You just dried up water in the heat. When the heat comes, you dry up. You don't provide sustenance. Right? You're there when it's not necessary. And then when the heat of horror comes, there's nothing left. Right? You see the terror that I've experienced. Why don't you respond to that terror? Right? He's saying to them now, you see it. Why don't you respond to what you see instead of responding to an argument that you've inherited? You had your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say that Eliphaz kept saying about the natural world. Right?
I can hear you.
He kept saying more about the natural world, like this is the order of things.
Right.
Job seems to be saying, well, here's some other natural things that you are not doing for me. Like you're not here, and those are other ways in which the world behaves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anybody want to supplement any of this? And I want to focus on one sequence of things.
For me,
Yeah, please.
This isn't so much like a theoretical contribution, but just in my own reflections, like I noticed that between the two people, like I find myself agreeing when Eliphaz speaks, and then agreeing when Job speaks, and then agreeing again and not being able to sort of decipher which side I'm actually on, because all of the points are so compelling, to think, Job can a mortal ever be righteous? And then to hear Job respond, really? Is it? And so I'm just sort of struck by how unstable I am in the narrative.
It's a very powerful point. And in a certain sense, it's glad that you were able to articulate that, because I'm sure we all feel that. I felt it many times reading the book. And maybe that's part of what the power of Newsome's attempt to talk about these multiple voices. Because we keep shifting. The book has unloosed a certain kind of ground. And there is a desire to find some stable place, a foothold. And you're articulating what I'm sure we all experience. There are parts of all of this that are resonating. So, it's part of it that's all resonating. It's a very funny book that way. You can identify with things that the friends are saying, and Job is saying, and it keeps something open, right? It's something very so. For me, that's part of the terror of reading the book. There's no simple solution here. It's all under heaven, and it's under heaven the whole day. It's a big game. Right? It's just a big betting match going on in heaven. You have no idea what's going on. And all of this is attempts to live a life of integrity under heaven. And no one knows the secret. That makes it all the more powerful, A, because nothing of the revealed tradition is given, right? And the friends are all, no one here is an Israelite. So there's a kind of it's talking about the universal state of human beings. There's a kind of the horror of natural theology, the greatness and the horror, over against revealed theology, in that which, but the text never even brings that into the play. Right? So now what I want to do for the last 10-15 minutes is to show you something quite powerful in Job's language. Again, we've been talking a little bit about biblical hermeneutics, and we talked in his first speech about subversive speech when he tries to undermine creation. I want to show you 4 types of subversive speech in chapter 7. We'll continue with this first cycle, and then we'll do it to the second cycle. We'll have one more class about the cycles of the speeches next week too, I think. So let us look at the first subversive speech. And that's verse 12.
Chapter 7.
In chapter 7, verse 12. So I just want to give you one stable translation. Am I the sea or the dragon, the 2 primordial monsters, that you have set a watch over me? The first one is to subvert these old mythological notions that God has turned him into the object of some kind of mythic battle. Who am I? What is the proportion and the relationship between what I have done and the way you hunt me down? And he cites any number of uses of this old battle against the sea, even used in the Psalms 74, 77, 89, you have places in Job. It appears over again in Scripture, taking over the old imagery from Canaanite, Ugaritic, and other battle scenes. Or uses of this to celebrate God. You all remember the passage from Isaiah 51, verses 9 to 11, where it calls, "Arise and show your strength, and defeat Leviathan as in days of old, and bring me from the exile." In other words, God's battle against Leviathan and Yam, the sea, at the creation, at the Exodus. And he's asking for it again. This was an act of consummate power. So in the first subversive narrative, he's saying this is a kind of displaced theomachy, a displaced battle against the demons of chaos. This is not a cosmic battle. I'm just a mortal being. Am I Yam? Am I Leviathan? Am I a sea dragon that threatens the world with chaos? That you hunt me down? Right? So he is using mythic images in the first subversion to say, you've got this whole thing out of whack. It's out of proportion. Are my actions subverting the universe that you have to now go on the rampage as if this is threatening creation with chaos. So notice how he's using one type of traditional image to ramp up his claim. That's subversive text number one. Second one is even more powerful. Going down to 17. Continuing the same argument. I'm going to read this, and then I want to ask you to look to another part of the scripture. What is man? What is a person that you make much of him? That you fix your attention upon him, inspecting him every morning, examining him every minute. Can't you just look in another direction? Check your iPhone. Come on, God, you must be getting a text message from somebody. What are you driving? Right? It must be something in the universe that you're getting a text message. Get your eye off human beings for a second. Check your messages. There's all kinds of stuff going on that you should be attending to. Right? So, some of I know it by heart, but I thought it'd be just it's more powerful just to read it. Do you have anybody has a text? Take a look now at Psalm 8. This is the counter text. I didn't want to show you. I just mentioned orally the one from Isaiah, but take a look at Psalm 8. So you can now see what he has, what text he is subverting. Verse 5. So I'll read this translated from the Hebrew. It's the same, almost the same terms. What is a human being that you think of him? Or the son of a human being that you pay attention? That you make him less than the angels of God and crown him with glory and honor. So if the psalm is a rhetorical glorification of the human being. The psalmist saying, what is a human being? That you have now so elevated a human being in stature. That you think of the human being. That you've raised the human being to glory among all the creatures of the earth. You've made the person just a little less than the gods or the angels in heaven. You've robed the human being with glory and honor and a crown of dignity. And the author of Job has turned this upside down. The language of the rhetoric, why have you even looked at a human being? What is the human being that you even give it such great attention? He says, why do you peel your eye on this human being like some kind with this monomaniacal focus? What is the human being? It's nothing. Why do you give such attention? Look somewhere else. Right? Notice this subversive narrative. The first narrative plays on the creation. This divine power has hunted down a human being as if they were a monster of chaos. And then he goes on to subvert the Psalms of praise. He subverts the Psalms of praise that rhetorically speak to the wonder of the species and say, what is a person that you would give a person such dignity in the world? They're just a walking animal. And now he's saying, what is a person that you can't take your eye off the person and hunt down the tiniest little stain? Don't you have any sense of proportion? Right? God is there, but what's going on here in this subversion? And then he says, right after that, even more strongly, in verse 20. First of all, he says, now take your eye off of me. You're staring me. Get your eyeball off of me. Right? And leave me be so I can swallow my spittle. I don't know how you translation, but that's what it says. So I can't even have time to swallow my spit. You don't give me breathing room. Listen, he's speaking to God. Right? Referring to God's. And then he goes on to say in verse 20. Notice what he's saying. We're going to hear this again later in Elihu. But notice what he says. And if I sinned, what have I done to you? You're a God. You're a God. Chatati, ma'ef Allah nutzer adam. So how does this affect you, creative human beings? I mean, God, get real. Get real, be a real God. Is this providence? Is this what providence is? What does my action do to you? Get some perspective. Right? Can't you be bigger than this? Mm-hmm. Let me just finish this. Can't you be bigger? Why have you made me into this trouble spot? An object of injury. And let me just do this last and then we'll have some questions. And then in verse 21. Why don't you forgive my sin? You're a God. Why don't you forgive my transgression? Right? We're talking about punishment, but let's talk about forgiveness. And overlook my error. Because now I'm going to just fall into the pit and die. In this fourth text, we have the subversion of Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. God's attributes are the attributes of mercy and forgiveness. And the language that is used here is using all the terminology of Exodus 34, 6 and 7. He's saying in this subversive speech, you, God, are not even the God you claim to be, who is merciful, forgiving sins, overlooking for the righteous, or even if a little bit of sin. But look where is forgiveness in this whole thing? Where is forgiveness? But notice, he doesn't just raise the claims. He does it by subverting scriptural sources that give the subversion this cultural power. Now, even if the book of Job is purporting to be a universal narrative, it's obviously written to a scriptural audience who would hear the countertext that's being subverted. So now you see the power of Job's speech here. Right? The Creator hounds a person like they are some kind of a dragon of chaos. He subverts Psalm 8. He subverts God, the forgiver of iniquity. Right? And God is not even large enough to look beyond this. What does it do to you? Does human sin hurt God? And if it doesn't hurt God, where's forgiveness? And why this fish eye that destroys me to that degree? Can you imagine a more powerful anti-divine diatribe than these 4 points? So in a certain sense, he's moved from this silence and the screaming to this claim that we know tradition. And he says, tradition doesn't cut it. Right? All of these major statements are being subverted. So you have the power of the subversive narrative that is being shrieked out in this astonishing sequence. It's all the more astonishing because it's part of one rhetorical unit. And if you hear that, you hear the attempt to use tradition to talk about a God who has not supported the language of tradition. That's the power of this, right? And there's real integrity to this voice. There's real integrity to this voice. It's all the more powerful because he turns all these pious texts upside down. So a couple of responses and then we'll break for today. It's an astonishing...
In my translation, I have watcher of men. What is the Hebrew close to that?
Which verse are you looking at?
20.
It's interesting. The Hebrew is notzer. And notzer was understood by the JPS or others as if it was the creator, as if yotzer, from yatzar, to create. I think that the reason that the author of Job, this is just a philological point, has chosen this is because he wants to make a double allusion. On the one hand, he's alluding to creation, right? Because he's used that language of the Creator. But in the language of Exodus 34:67, the Hebrew is Notzer Chesed La'alafim. God guards or watches Chesed or mercy to the thousands. So he's able to have a further allusion to the text that will follow in the next verse. So it's a double entendre. I think that because it says, I think the first level is probably God is the creator. But he wants to say that God has overly attended to the human being. So he has 3 puns going on simultaneously. God is the creator. God is the super watcher beyond all need and all measure. And God's attribute as being the caretaker of the Notzer Chesed, who watches or cares or preserves Chesed, mercy and righteousness is exactly what God is not doing. And he has set up that from the Exodus, the attribute formula, which immediately follows. So there's a very, very strategic use of language here, as you can see. And it's good for you to have, I'm glad, thank you for raising that, because it allows you to say that here too he's alluding to the attribute formula. So here you can see the power of rhetoric. And at this level of screen, it's trying to pull the threads of the scriptural text out of their encasing. So he's pulling all the threads of Scripture, which is the threads of theology. Yeah.
What was the Exodus verse you said, Jobus?
34, 6 and 7. That's the attribute formula. That's when Moses sees God in the crevice of the rock, and God says, Lord, Lord, with mercy and with kindness, and so on. So that's the famous 13 attributes of mercy. And that's precisely what's being undermined. All right. So let's break. We'll pick up the after class, but let's break with that, because I know that people have to run to the Wednesday lunch. And we'll continue next time. Are we reading some more of the Job material, right?
Yes, 15 to 21.
Huh?
15 to 21.
All right. So we're gonna read more of the cycles. I'm gonna choose a couple of sections to read. Why don't you also find something that you want to bring in that is something that rang in a powerful way to you, and then we can also talk about that. So we're going to continue to talk about what does it mean to have this kind of a discourse and the way it is being expressed. So I think you can begin to see. And then bear one question in mind. Okay? What would it take to persuade a person? What is persuasion? I want to begin next week talking about what would persuade the other side to shift their ground. Right? Or are these just dueling banjos? Right? Are they dueling banjos? Or is persuasion an option? All right, I leave it to you. Thanks.